Okay, here we are, getting started again. And we're on the last day of this week. We're doing 1787 still. And that is George Washington and structuring the Constitution. And hopefully you've had a chance to watch the movie that I sent you a link for yesterday. Very, very well done. It gives you a great understanding of the things going on in the Constitutional Convention. It's not perfect. It's not everything. I don't know that we know really everything, but it was really, really well done. And I highly recommend that you take the time to watch it if you have not watched it yet. I'm not going to go through nitty-gritty details of the convention today. I want to finish off the war. Not as detailed as yesterday, but some important points so that you can get where we got to at the end and why there was a need for a constitutional convention. And then I want to go through a 5,000-year leap principle. And I know we're on Article 5 with the Constitution, but I think it would be good if we went through the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, because it's important with what we're talking about with the Constitution to understand the Bill of Rights that was put together. If you've watched the video already of the More Perfect Union, then you understand that there was concern in the Constitutional Convention about the rights of the people being trampled on. And so I want to go through that Bill of Rights. I think for the most part, you'll really understand the different things they put in there because they were a direct reflection of the rights that had been trampled by the king that led to the war, that led to America's independence. So I want to go through those today because I think they go in conjunction with our lesson for today. So yesterday, as we finished the day, we had a victory and not enough men to end the war because they had won there in Trenton and they took Princeton, but without enough men, because after fighting all day and marching all night and not enough men, they were not able to head in and take the rest of it. And so they had to leave New Brunswick, which was the field headquarters for the British Army. That could have ended the war right there. Instead, that war continued on. Now, Washington's men are in Morristown. There's a lot of disease and a lot of sickness, and his men were decimated. They went from 5,300 to 3,000. Now, their win at Princeton and at Trenton encouraged the American people, and so more soldiers were signed up, enlisted to be a part of the army, and came and joined them. They also were able to, so that steady flow was 9,000 new men. They also received 22,000 muskets from the French. During all of this time, Benjamin Franklin has been in France trying to convince the French to join the battle and to help the American colonists to do this. One of the things that helps at this point too, in 1777, is that there is a general of the British. He comes down from Canada. His name was General Burgoyne. And he came to try to seize Fort Ticonderoga. Remember the Americans, especially Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys, they won Fort Ticonderoga early in the war. General Burgoyne comes down and tries to take Fort Ticonderoga, I can't say that word, back, and he loses in Bennington. Now, that was not an expected victory, but an important victory. They capture him at Saratoga with 5,700 of his original 8,000 men. So it's a huge capture, huge shock to Europe. They had gone down to defeat, and 5,000 British and German prisoners are in the hands of the Americans. Unfortunately, at the same time, William Howe has come up and he takes Philadelphia. Now, that Philadelphia, if you remember, is the headquarters. It is the governing seat for the Americans. And so they lose that. But this forces General Washington to retreat to Valley Forge. And Valley Forge is probably one of the most famous parts of the war. Everybody seems to know of all of the deprivations of the men there, living on fire cakes morning, noon, and night, scurvy because they weren't having fresh fruits and vegetables, no vitamin C in what they were eating. And they didn't have clothing. They didn't all have coats. They were cutting down trees to make log cabins just to have a place to stay. So it was a very, very difficult time. 2,000 of George Washington's men died at Valley Forge. So it was a very difficult place. And there's a story told. We do not have record of it. So it's somewhat myth, possibly true, but it's told that many of the men were ready to desert and to go home. And George Washington, we know, was a man of God, a man of prayer. And it is reported that he was found praying by the men who were coming to resign. And when they saw him praying, heard him praying, they removed themselves and stayed. What we do have that we know is true is that he did go to the woods to pray. There was a Quaker that lived in that area. Most of the Quakers were Tories. They were for the king. They were not for a free America. But a Quaker lived near there, and as he was walking through the woods, he could overhear someone. And so he, tried to figure out what it was, and he found George Washington praying. And he went home, and it's interesting because it changed his view on the war. And not that he wanted to join the war, but he said, if we have a praying general, and I'm summarizing, if we have a praying general, there's no way the British will win. So he surprised his family by his changeover of opinion and feeling about America's independence and freedom. But we know that we had a praying general. Now, capturing Burgoyne in 1777 convinces the French to join, convinces them that maybe there's some help that they can give. So they send 2 fleets, and that renews the hopes of the Americans because they know they're coming. And the other thing that happens that helps is a man came. His name was, Lafayette also came. He was in charge of those fleets. But no, we are talking about Lieutenant General Baron von Steuben, who was a Prussian.
Yeah.
Now he's not really a baron, just for the record, but he was given that title somewhat to help the Americans look at him as being useful. By the time they figured out he wasn't a baron, he had won their admiration and respect so much it didn't matter to them that he wasn't actually a baron. But he had been given the title, but it wasn't a true title. Okay, so it's I don't get it a little bit, but it's kind of funny. But he saw these troops, and it just broke his heart to see the condition they're in. But he took several of the men and he began to train them so that they could then go train groups of men. And he trained them in how to march and how to work together as a group. And this training here, along with the French fleets, are a large part of why the Revolutionary War was won. Okay. Now, we had General Howe and Admiral Howe. They both resigned. General Clinton takes over. And Washington is planning to go and fight with him because Clinton was planning to take all of his troops from Philadelphia back to New York. Washington wanted to head that off. Unfortunately, there was a traitor in their midst, General Lee, who informed the British of what Washington was going to do.
Wait, so General Lee and Benedict Arnold?
Mm-hmm. General Charles Lee was later court-martialed for this act.
Okay.
So yes, you did not always have people who stayed true. So he was able, General Clinton was able to get back to New York, and so Washington then took up his post outside of New York just to make sure that they didn't have troop movement again. Lord Cornwallis took most of the South, so Charleston, Savannah. So you've got the British in New York, you've got British in the South. Patrick Ferguson, was sent by Cornwallis to take a position on Kings Mountain. And he said, not even the demons of hell or the Almighty could dislodge him, but guess who did? The Virginia Green Mountain Boys dislodged him. And Ferguson did not live through that particular difficulty. Now, Cornwallis continues to have great losses. The French warships, however, were damaged so badly by the British, they had to return home for repairs, return to New York for repairs. But this opportunity with the French fleet on the seacoast allowed him to march over and surround Yorktown. Okay. And that made Cornwallis a little bit desperate because he didn't want to be trapped. So he's trying to get his men across the river. His plan is to fight northward, get northward. And he's in boats and a hurricane comes. This is not the first time weather has been a factor in George Washington being able to have success. So even Cornwallis said it looked like God was on Washington's side.
That's saying something.
So on October 17th, a little teenage redcoat drummer boy appeared on a British parapet up above, and all the different cannons going. Nobody could hear anything he was doing, but they stopped the battle because he was drumming for a parley. A parley is an opportunity to kind of regroup a little bit, to talk. And the British Cornwallis asked for a 24-hour armistice. That means a stop of fighting. General Washington said, we'll give you 2. And the result of this is we want your unconditional surrender. They're kind of surrounded. And on October 19th, 2 lines formed on the battlefield. One is American, one is French. And in between those 2 lines of soldiers, well, at the head of it, you've got the French commander, you've got General Washington. Cornwallis did not come. They were defeated. He would not come. He sent his second in command, Admiral O'Hara, because one of the official acts of ending a war was that the commander's sword would be given to the other commander. It was a very official kind of a ceremony. But General Cornwallis didn't come. So here comes O'Hara and other British soldiers. And he goes first to the French commander to try to give his sword to the French commander. And the Frenchman's like, not my battle. He signals over to Washington. He comes to Washington. There's Washington. He's the head of the Continental Army. O'Hara is not. He's second in command. So General Washington, recognizing it as a slight to him and to the American people, refuses to accept the sword and makes him go to one of his subordinates to give the sword over. Giving the sword over is the signal that all of the rest of the troops of the British are to also turn over their weapons and surrender them and acknowledge themselves captured as prisoners of war. And so this is the end of the war, October 19th, 1781. Little drama there, but either way, they win. The shock of this in Europe is absolutely flabbergasting to everybody. How could a little band of American colonists beat the mighty British Empire? A British Empire that it was said the sun never set on the British Empire. That's how much power and control they had in the world. And this little band of Americans beat them. Well, with the French, that's true. Okay. So interestingly enough, even though this is happening in October 1781, the actual peace treaty was not acknowledged until January of 1783. So a little over a year.
1783?
Yes, it takes time for a peace treaty to go all the way through. That's when it was read to the army. The war is truly over at that point. The formal treaty was not even signed until September. And the British packed up and departed the city of New York before Washington enters on December 2nd, 1783. It's a little over 2 years from this surrender to the British leaving. All right. Now, as you know, because we've talked about it a little bit, they nearly collapsed. Inflation runs like crazy. The continental dollars are useless. They are just have no worth. It's unstable. And so it reaches a point where we have rioting. People aren't accepting money that's been printed. Every state is acting like its own separate nation, and they're fighting with each other. You got a little bit of that when you were watching the movie. If you haven't watched it, there's a little bit of that in there. So they're opposing each other. They're having heavy import duties and tariffs and fines on the other states. And so it really is a serious impedance to just even being able to have commerce. And they didn't have that before. They didn't have that before the war. This is a new thing. They're just kind of trying to work out the kinks. And the federal government, under the Articles of Confederation, that were deliberately weak, had no power to do anything about it. And so a lot of what was happening that maybe was helpful at times was that different states would meet together. So in 1785, George Washington Madison initiated delegates between Virginia and Maryland to come together and try to figure out their disputes. So they come together and they're able to solve their conflict. That gives them some confidence. Maybe we've got some hope here. And so then they try to convince others to do it. They have Congress call a trade conference of all the states. Let's bring all the states together in a conference and let's work out these difficulties. 5 states showed up. 5 out of 13 showed up. And so it just continued to be a problem. So this is the point at which they call for a constitutional convention. And they continue to push for it, and they set the convention for May 14th, 1787. That's when it's supposed to start. Here's our date. And interestingly enough, 73 delegates were appointed. You've all heard the number 55. Why 55? Because only 55 came. Of the 73 appointed, 55 came. Now, sometimes coming was impeded by the fact they just couldn't afford to get there. These delegates were not paid to go. Their expenses were not covered, and sometimes they simply did not have the funds to get there or take care of themselves once they did. And 55? So 55 came. Even James Madison had to borrow money to attend. James Madison, who was the one pushing to be able to make all of these changes, had to borrow money to attend.
Wow.
Rhode Island did not send a representative. You'll have noticed that, I hope, in the film. They did not send a representative. They felt like they were just so small, and they had no intention of consenting to a stronger central government because they were so small. They wanted their vote to count, and that was the big argument in the Constitutional Convention. And so they just refused to come at all. They would not consent to such a thing. There were some businessmen, however, 13 of them, that wrote a letter apologizing for the behavior of their leaders to the convention. So not everybody in Rhode Island felt the same way about it. The leaders felt that way about it. So they wanted to make sure that the convention knew that this was not the will of all the people of Rhode Island and that they didn't get
Their say.
Yeah, because they weren't getting their say. They didn't want the people at the convention to be upset with all of Rhode Island, even though their leaders were a problem. Remember, Washington almost didn't come. It was James Madison writing to him and writing to him and writing to him. If you don't come, there is no convention. If you have to come, even if we have to have you here on a stretcher. So remember, he strapped his arm to his chest because he had the rheumatism in that shoulder and arm, and then took a carriage to Philadelphia. Now, we are used to riding in cars. Cars have shocks, and they kind of, we hit some bumps or whatever, but pretty smooth all the way around, unless you're in labor. And you guys don't know anything about that, but the moms do. Carriage rides are not smooth.
Every rock in the road.
So he would have still been in pain even in a carriage. Probably not the same as trying to ride a horse, but still would have had some pain even just sitting in a carriage.
Well, there you can't say the roads were entirely level either. So
No, the roads wouldn't have been great either. So there's definitely some issues and difficulties, but he came. Benjamin Franklin was 81. Benjamin Franklin lived in Philadelphia, so that was helpful. He didn't have to make a long trip. He had gout and a stone, probably a kidney stone, so severely he couldn't even ride in a carriage. So he was carried into Independence Hall each day on a sedan chair. Now, if you don't know what that is, it's a chair that has 4 poles attached to it so that people can carry you. So he literally sat in a chair, and 4 men, and they were convicts, but they were supposedly trusty convicts and strong because they had to carry a man. They carried him to and from the convention every day. It's the only way he was going to get there. Now, when Bob and I first got married, when your dad and I first got married, he had 2 bouts with gout, and he was on crutches. It was bad. Gout is not a fun experience. So, yeah, he wasn't going to walk in to this convention. And so they brought him in. 2 men who made some of the greatest contributions to the convention weren't even there. One is John Adams.
Oh, and Thomas Jefferson.
Yes, John Adams is serving as the American minister in England. Thomas Jefferson is serving as the American minister in France. Thomas Jefferson remember, he had written a defense of the constitutions of the government. Oh, sorry, John Adams had. A defense of the constitutions of government of the United States of America. And so that had been widely read by the delegates. Thomas Jefferson sent several hundred carefully selected books to James Madison. So in the movie, when you watch, he gets this box of books. Oh no, maybe that was one of the shipments.
That was a lot of books.
Several hundred carefully selected books to Madison so that he could be just a walking encyclopedia on the history of governments of the past. Also corresponding with him on what he considered to be essential elements of a constitution. So Thomas Jefferson, not there, but an enormous contributor to James Madison's knowledge and understanding so that he could help represent there. Yes, Catherine?
We have to remember that Thomas Jefferson was also very well educated, so he knew how to select books.
He had read these books, and he had been studying this out for years and years and years.
His library.
Definitely came out of his library. Okay, so yes, Joseph.
For a second.
Yeah.
One of my favorite stories it's after the convention, but they're carrying Franklin out of the hall.
Okay, you can't tell me the after the convention before the convention.
Fine.
Hang on to your after the convention before the convention.
Fine, I'll wait.
So even about a month before the convention even convened, Madison had written, remember he came in, he had written a summary of the weaknesses of the Articles of the Confederation. And it was entitled The Vices of the Political System of the United States. And he outlined the kind of constitution he thought would remedy the situation. So that Virginia plan that was put forward was actually Madison's plan. Okay, let's see what else. So the men who came, 55 men, these are really important men. They had a lot of knowledge. They had a lot of background. They're not backwoodsy guys. Sometimes that is the accusation made against them to try to make the document seem like it doesn't apply to today. Let me tell you about these men. 2 of them were college presidents, William S. Johnson and Abraham Baldwin. 3 of them had been college professors, George Wythe, James Wilson, and William C. Houston. 4 had studied law in England. 9 had been born in foreign countries and knew the oppressions of Europe from first-hand experience. They lived there. They'd experienced it. 28 had served in Congress, and most of the rest had served in state legislatures. 19 or more had served in the Army, 17 as officers, and 4 of them on Washington's staff. These men were well qualified for what they needed to do there. Now, fortunately, they were meant to meet on May 14th, but only 2 states had arrived by this date. It took some time to get everybody there, but Virginia and Pennsylvania were there first. Virginia and Pennsylvania, that's the abbreviations for them.
I hope Pennsylvania was there first.
They live there, right? So Virginia, seeing that there would be a delay, began holding early morning planning sessions where Madison would outline the results of his research so that he could share with others why he felt the changes needed to be made. And he recommended a structure of government that was completely different from those Articles of Confederation. Remember that. So by the time the rest had arrived, the majority had arrived, these men had worked up 15 resolutions. They called them the 15 resolves. That they felt would formulate the best system of government. Okay. Other resolutions were added. They just brought 15 in with them. And so the Constitution really was the result of these 55 men working together. And sometimes it got heated. Sometimes their debates were not so nice. But when they finally officially began, and that was on May 25th, the first order of business is to select a president of the convention. Surprise, surprise, George Washington.
Not really surprised, but
the notes that James Madison made of the Congress were kept secret for 30 years for security reasons.
what was?
The notes that Madison made. Remember how he sits up at the front of the convention making notes?
Yeah.
So there was a secretary of the convention. He wasn't really competent. So in reality, your true secretary of the convention is James Madison.
Wait, what do you mean he wasn't really competent?
He wasn't as understanding of what needed to be written down and what needed to be recorded as James Madison was. So the reality is that the secretary and historian for the conference, the Constitutional Convention, is really James Madison, even though Major Jackson from South Carolina was the man appointed to it. He kept and you'll see in the video that the housekeeper there, the keeper of the inn where he stays, is always like, you're up so late and you're up so early. And she's concerned about him because he stayed so late every night filling in the details of his notes so that nothing was lost, that he occasionally made himself ill just from the fatigue and the overwork of making those kinds of notes. It was very, very important to him that this be documented. He recognized the importance of what they were doing here. But those notes were kept secret for 30 years because of security reasons. They're finally published by an act of Congress in 1843. And they are the most authoritative record available on the convention. So James Madison's notes. Now, if you'll remember from the video, all proceedings in the Constitutional Convention were to be kept secret. Do you remember why?
So they could change their minds freely?
They wanted to be able to have debate. They didn't want to have false information or rumors going out. And so they wanted to keep everything happening there secret. And also, if you voted one way one day and you've been changed, you've been convinced to change your mind, you didn't want to have the embarrassment of having changed your mind coming out to the public. And so it gave them the ability to change their mind and not worry about pride or any of those things that might have kept them from being able to have the full open discussion and back and forth debate that they had. Each state only had one vote. Okay, that meant everybody from a state had to be present and in agreement for their vote to count. They were expected to pay attention to what was being said, so they couldn't read other papers or books or documents while someone else was speaking. They were to pay attention to what was happening. So really important rule. Also, a concern was that it not just become a shouting match, which you sometimes saw in England with the Parliament. Just go answer that really quickly. So all remarks were to be addressed to the president of the convention. They were not to talk to each other. So if you had a disagreement with a Miranda across the table, you weren't going to talk to her. You were going to talk to me. I'm the president of the convention. You will talk to me. All your remarks come to the president of the convention. That is to help keep it from becoming just a shouting match and unkind. Okay, what else? They really wanted to reach agreement. They wanted to reach consensus and not a compromise. Why is that important? Those 55 men are sitting there in chambers. They're making the decisions. Why not just a majority? Any idea?
Because that one's taken back out saying, I don't want part of this.
Mm-hmm. That. And when they went back to their states, they needed to be the ones to rally and lobby for their state to accept it. Because just because they agreed to it there in convention did not make it legally binding. It still had to be ratified by the states. So if people left unhappy with what they'd created, are they going to go lobby for their state to ratify it? No way. So they really wanted to get as much consensus as possible. They also decided to conduct all or almost all of their discussion as a committee of the whole, meaning they were all part of the committee. They all would discuss and they would vote. That gives you the opportunity to change your mind. In the General Assembly, a vote is binding. In a committee, you vote to see where people are. And you vote to see if we still have things to talk about. If everybody's in agreement, you stop talking and move on to the next thing. But if we're not in agreement, we know we have something more to talk about. So Committee of the Whole gave them the opportunity to have great discussion. Okay? Some of the topics that were really hard. One, how soon should the national government regulate or abolish slavery? That was the first one that was very hard. The second one, whether votes in Congress should be according to individual states or the population of the states. So proportionate or just each state having its own vote. All right. And that was a big debate. And the third one, this one is interesting, whether the federal government should have the authority to regulate interstate commerce. It's kind of miraculous that those were the only three big arguments of the whole thing, but they were big. And the first two especially nearly took it down. Very, very difficult. So even though James Madison is really the person who came up with these 15 resolves, it was Governor Randolph who presented them. And if you'll remember, he presented them as just, we need to make some changes to our Constitution. He wasn't presenting it as brand new, throw the articles out, but it was very quickly recognized that what he was proposing was a complete new system. It was not a change to this. Okay. So 4 months in convention. Now I want you to know something. Because everything was secret, they did not open the windows.
Wow. It gets hot back there in the east.
4 months starting on May 14th means they went to September. All the way through the hot and humid months of the summer in Philadelphia. And it is hot and it is humid. And there was no air conditioning back then. In order to keep it secret, in order to keep everybody from knowing what was going on, the doors and the windows were kept shut. They did not dress like we dress now. They wore those heavy coats and long sleeves and stockings and shoes and breech pants every day. So they were not sitting in comfortable circumstances, having these debates and arguments and discussions. This was a huge sacrifice for them to make for their country. Now, about 2 months into it, about June 28th, quarreling, heated debate is coming on. You'll see this in the video, but Benjamin Franklin stands up. And he says, I have lived a long time, sir. And the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this, and I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in building this political building no better than the builders of Babel. We shall be divided by our little partial local interests. Our projects will be confounded, and we ourselves shall become a reproach and a byword down to future ages. And what is worse, mankind may hereafter, from this unfortunate instant, despair of establishing government by human wisdom and leave it to chance, war, or conquest. I therefore beg leave to move that hereafter prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessing on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business, and that one or more of the clergy of this city be requested to officiate in that service. So we've made a call to prayer. He said, we cannot do this without the help of the Almighty. They did invite in a minister to serve as the chaplain and offer daily prayers. That was a motion made. It did not pass for one simple reason, and that is that ministers required payment for their prayers, and the convention had no money. So they made the motion, but it was not accepted because of money. Nevertheless, this plea that he made seemed to have a sobering effect on the members of the Convention. And they were able to set aside their quarreling and debates and set about their task with greater determination. Less than 90 days later, they had the Constitution. So just that plea for prayer helped to sober and bring down the rhetoric in such a way that they could have their conversation. All right. Now, Joseph wants to tell us what Benjamin Franklin said after.
Not said, it's something that happened after.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'm going to say what he said. The rising sun. Because he sat there, there was a sun on the back of the chair of the president of the convention. And it was, like you would have if it were a rising sun, you only show just the half of it. That was on the back of the chair. And he's watched that, he's looked at it, and he said, I've been watching this as the convention has progressed, and I've been trying to determine whether it's a rising sun or a setting sun that we're seeing as we're having this convention. And by the time they were through, he felt that what they were experiencing was a rising sun for this nation being born. So a rising and not a setting sun, because it really was that important. They were either going to succeed or they were going to fail. And failure would mean that they would no longer be the United States of America. Now, Joseph, hurry, quickly give us what you wanted to share.
Okay. I don't know where this story exactly comes from, but it's one that I've heard and enjoyed for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And they're carrying Benjamin Franklin out of the convention. Mm-hmm. And something happens that this and the sedan chair starts to fall, and one of the other delegates runs over and grabs it before it can fall over. Mm-hmm. And I just always kind of like that. It showed the unity of men. Mm-hmm. Also, Benjamin Franklin had a lot of respect among those men.
A lot of respect, well respected. Yeah.
It just shows that.
Yeah. A lot of love and respect between those men. Now, I want to go to the 5,000 Year Leap for just a few minutes, and then I want to go to the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. In this book here, 5,000 Year Leap, we are on Principle 21, which is found on page 235 in your book. It's a very simple principle, and it is a very important principle, one that we are seeing undermined very seriously in our country for quite some time, but especially lately. Strong local self-government is the keystone to preserving human freedom. Okay, remember what a keystone is. A keystone in an arch, okay, if you have an arch, here's your arch. And this stone right at the top, this one right here, is called a keystone. And it's really an interesting stone because all the rest of the stones are stacked up and they come around. All of their pressure pushes against that keystone. If you remove the keystone, or if it is weak, the whole arch falls. Without the keystone, the arch does not stand. So to call this the keystone is a very, very interesting phrase. Strong local self-government is the keystone to preserving human freedom. Political power always gravitates to the center, a central government. And the whole point of the Constitution is to not have a single central government. And that's kind of that golden key that we're looking at there, because we need people to be involved. If you're on the local level, you're meeting, what they did in early colonial eras was that they would meet in the town tavern and they would talk about what was going on in town. This was a part of governing their people. This was a throwback to the Saxons, and that was how they handled it. When they had their tribal meetings, everyone was there. Everyone was involved in the discussion. They had a leader, but his vote didn't count more than anybody else's. And they would sit and they would talk and discuss and they would take votes. And that was how decisions were made. And it was local and it was close. It affected you and you stayed close. And it was voluntary. Nobody was paid. Nobody was required. It was voluntary and people went. And when you get farther and farther and farther away from the people, less people are paying attention. They're more busy in the daily, day-to-day than they are in the conversation. And so they really wanted to keep that. And one of the things that Jefferson noticed is that in those New England towns that were a little closer together, they had that element of having their local strong governments, as opposed to where he was coming from in Virginia, where he lived kind of far out from town. They didn't have that kind of interaction. And you really felt like that close-knit New England town had something going for it. He says it was the wisest invention ever devised by the wit of man for the perfect exercise of self-government and for its preservation. That strong local self-government helps to preserve the whole. So he was extremely anxious for us to get back to that because he knew that it had been there in England before. The crown had been removing those rights from the English people as well. We've learned in history earlier that there was always that fight back and forth. Starting with the Magna Carta, that was a fight to get rights back. And so the crown is always trying to remove those rights. And so in Britain, in Great Britain and England, when the colonists were coming over, by and large, that had been lost in England. But for some reason, maybe just because there were so few of them and they needed that kind of support from each other, that town hall type meeting of people meeting together and discussing and deciding came back into play. Even before they got off the Mayflower, what did they do? They had a meeting, the Mayflower Compact, and they agreed to the rules they were going to live by when they got off the ship. Every man was to be there and to have a vote. So that same principle started things here. One other thing I wanted to bring out. Thomas Jefferson says, the way to have good and safe government is not to trust it all to one, but to divide it among the many, distributing to everyone exactly the functions he is competent to perform best. Let the national government be entrusted with the defense of the nation and its foreign relations and federal relations. The state governments, civil rights, laws, police, and the administration of concerns of the state. Okay? That's very different than we have now. The federal government, in his mind, was only for defending the nation and foreign and federal relations. So relations between states, relations between America and other countries.
What page was that?
That's on page 238. As opposed to the states, who needed to look at the civil rights of the people, the laws governing the people, the police, administration of any kind of state concerns. Now counties, he said, counties with the local concerns of the counties. That's coming even smaller. And each ward, township, direct the interests within itself. That is what we have set up. We just don't do it very well. By dividing and subdividing these republics from the great national one down, until it ends in the administration of every man's farm by himself. By placing under everyone what his own eye may superintend, that all will be done for the best. The easiest way to destroy liberty is to give too much power into any one person's hands, or to let it get too far away from you. The powers delegated to the Constitution are few and they're defined. Those that remain to the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former federal powers will be exercised principally on external objects, war, peace, negotiation, foreign commerce. Powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects in the ordinary course of affairs concerning the lives, liberties, and properties of the people and the internal order and improvement. And also the federal government was intended to remain small, not large. Jefferson felt like the things that they needed to do were just simple enough that they did not need large departments or agencies. Now, if you know anything about our government now, you know it is large. It is not small. And I just want to have there's one last thing here. And it was written by John Fiske. He said, if the day should ever arrive when the people of the different parts of our country shall allow their local affairs to be administered by prefects sent from Washington, and when the self-government of the states shall have been so far lost, on that day the political career of the American people will have been robbed of its most interesting and valuable features. We've done it. We have given away local power to the government. We need to take it back. It needs to be done legally, but I think it can be done if people can begin to understand that they've given rights to the government that were theirs, rights that they needed to take care of for themselves. Now, we have 12 minutes and 10 amendments. You ready?
Sure.
Okay. This is a speed round. Amendment 1. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. There will not be one government, one religion. They can't tell you which one to join. Or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Right now, we do not have the right to peaceably assemble. Amendment 2, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. You constantly have people voting for gun regulation or the removal of guns. What did Hitler do in Germany? He took people's guns. What did the English try to do to the American colonists? They wanted to take their guns and their ammunition. What are they calling for now? People shouldn't have guns. Guns are dangerous. Guns aren't dangerous. They don't shoot themselves. Guns aren't dangerous. Amendment 3, no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. No quartering of soldiers. Remember when we learned yesterday, the quartering of soldiers meant that whoever the lead head soldier was in charge of your house. They didn't just come like guests. They were entitled to do whatever they wanted as long as they were in your house. They were in charge. That's our amendment number 3. Amendment 4, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue. But upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. They cannot walk into your house to search without a warrant. They have to show probable cause to a judge for a warrant to be extended. They have to say exactly what they're going to search and what they are searching for a warrant to be extended. And they can't go any farther than what that warrant allows. Remember the writs of assistance where they could walk into your house and say, oh, I think that is a smuggled item. I'll be taking that now. Except they weren't that nice in how they said it. Amendment 5. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, meaning you will not be taken and put into jail without an indictment from a grand jury. They have to prove in the first place that there is possible reason to suspect you. The only exception to that, except in cases arriving in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war and public danger. In time of war, when serving in the Army, the Navy, they can put you in jail because sometimes there's not time to take care of it. Remember in the Book of Mormon when Captain Moroni had to take the kingmen who were fighting against them, put them into prison, and there was not time at that point to handle their trials in time of war and public danger. It's the only time, and you have to be military or someone suspected of treason for that to happen. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb. They cannot try you twice for the same crime. If you have been tried and you have been proven to be innocent, it's over. What they figured was at that point, if you actually weren't innocent, it was between you and God would take care of your punishment. Let's see. Nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. So you can't be called to be a witness. You can say, I want to be a witness for myself. You can't be forced to it. It's very easy to be confused on a witness stand or to say something you don't intend to say that would incriminate you incorrectly. They also cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. They can't just come take it. They've got to be able to sue you at law for it. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So a lot of things there to deal with your person and your property in your life. Amendment 6. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial. They're not going to leave you laying in jail for months and months and years. Speedy, there's a time limit. Public, they can't do it secretly and then throw you away forever. Okay. They also shall be a trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed. You're entitled to have a jury. And you're entitled to be able to make some selection in that jury so that they can't just bring in people who will convict you without actually hearing the case. And it has to be done close to where you lived, where it happened. Which district shall have been previously ascertained by law to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation. They cannot throw you in jail and not tell you why you're being accused. You have to be made aware of what you're being accused of. To be confronted with the witnesses against him. You have a right to hear what they're saying about you. To have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor. So compulsory means to compel someone. If you are at trial and you need witnesses and you know who could witness for you, they have to come. They have to come and witness and do that. Otherwise, they're breaking the law. And to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. You are not to be tried without the assistance, without somebody to be there in your corner. Amendment 7. In suits at common law, where the value in controversy shall exceed $20. Now, that doesn't seem like much today, but it was a lot more back then. The right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of common law. Again, can't be tried twice. Most civil suits are handled by a judge, not by a jury. But if it turns to be something of value greater than $20, you have the right to request a trial by jury. Remember, with the writs of assistance and with these other encroachments by King George, their only process was to ask for it to be tried back in England. And they didn't necessarily have to respond to it or agree to it, and who could afford it because it was far away from where it happened as opposed to right where it happened. All of these things come from those kinds of egregious acts during that time. Amendment 8, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. When you are accused of a crime, when you are indicted, a judge can determine if you are a flight risk, if they think you would run away and not show up to court. And if so, he can hold you in jail, or he can say you can be released on payment of a certain amount of bail. Now, that is supposed to be returned if you come back to court. The bail is to induce you to come back to court, but not excessive, not so that it can't be raised. Also, no excessive fines imposed and no cruel or unusual punishment inflicted. Whatever your judgment is, it should not be cruel and unusual punishment. Article 9, Amendment 9. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. If I make a list of rights in the Constitution, that's what these 10 amendments are, that doesn't mean those are the only rights. It doesn't take away any other rights just because they aren't listed here. And that's what that says. It doesn't take them away just because we didn't list them. Can you imagine trying to list all of your rights?
There'd be 2,700 amendments.
There'd be a lot. And so it's saying just because it's not written down here doesn't mean that you don't have those rights. And then number 10, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So let's put that in English. Powers that are not delegated to the United States by the Constitution and that are not prohibited to the states. So if the Constitution says no, the state can't have that. So if it's not denied, if it's not delegated to the United States, if it's not prohibited to the states, it is reserved to the states and the people. So any powers, any rights not part of the federal government or not denied to the states are reserved to them. So it's like number 9, where we're not going to list every single power. We're not going to list every single right. We're going to say these are the parameters, and this is how you know who's supposed to be in charge of that. Okay? So look at that, 59 minutes and 22 seconds, 10 amendments, Bill of Rights. Go watch the movie if you haven't watched it. Watch it again if you want to watch it again. There's a lot of good information in there. In your book, it goes through more with the Constitutional Convention. It also has the Constitution in there and some language to help you understand it better. So I highly recommend that you take a look at that. Next week, we begin a new section, which is in 1830. And Andrew Jackson is the man that we will be studying, and it's called The Age of Reform. So that's about 40 years after the Constitution. And we'll take a look at what was happening during that time in this country. And we'll see you later. It's over.